Welcome to our Vessel Performance Info webinar, Making Vessel Performance Easier for Crew. Our guest speakers today are Jakob Peterson, Director at Vessel Performance Solutions, Harriet Honeysett-Johnson, Head of Maritime at Signal, and Mikhail Lorin, Head of Vessel Optimization at Manta Marine. If you have any questions about the topics today, please type them in the Q&A section and we'll get them answered for you at the end of the presentation. Here is our host, Carl Jeffrey from Digital Ship, to explain more.
So our topic today is how to make vessel performance easier for crew. We're completely reliant on crew when we want to improve performance. We need them to follow our suggested routes and speeds, and there's many other interventions they can make, like when to operate generators. But we also need to make it easy for them to do, and they need to see that their efforts are worthwhile, and crew have plenty of other work to do at the same time. And we're also hearing that getting good quality performance data from ships is very hard. It's hard to get accurate data in the noonday report, which is done manually by crew. And if we've got sensors gathering data, we find they're often miscalibrated, and seafarers might not have the skills to spot faults or fix problems. And we're hearing that crew may have reached the limit of what they're able to think about. So we hear the term cognitive load. If we add something more to their cognitive load, something else gets taken away. So that's the background to what we're going to hear today, which is three very interesting talks. First, we're going to hear from Jakob Peterson, who's Director of Vessel Performance Solutions based in Copenhagen. Jakob has probably been thinking about vessel performance longer than anyone else. He was head of vessel performance with Maersk Group back in 2004. So he's going to explain how his company is supporting crew to make much more accurate noonday reports, and how his company has tools to identify faulty data. And the company also has tools to help crews see how their vessel is performing compared to others in the fleet. And second, we're going to hear from Harriet Honeysett-Johnson, Head of Maritime with Signal. That's a company specializing in behavioral science in supporting crew. They work in the maritime and aviation sectors. Harriet spent 9 years as a deck officer in the Merchant Navy, and Signal develops tools which help crew members be more motivated to improve performance. So they've got tools which give performance targets to individuals, and they can show if people can see if they're reaching their personal targets. And third, we're going to hear from Mikhail Lorin, who's head of vessel optimization with Manta Marine, formerly known as Yarra Marine. He's joining us from Gothenburg. Mikhail is a former CEO of Lorin Maritime, a tanker operator, and he's going to show how Manta can help crew focus their attention on what's most important, probably speed and fuel consumption. And meanwhile, Manta's got tools which automate keeping the engine at a consistent power output, so that's much more efficient, so crew don't have to think about it. So we're going to have three talks of about 10 minutes, and there should be plenty of time for questions. You can put questions in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll take the questions at the end, unless Jakob and Harriet want to provide written answers to questions while the later talks are going on. So if you can please say who a question is for if you enter it. And I'd like to invite Jakob to start his talk. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Carl. Thank you for that, and welcome to everybody. I will try and see if I can manage to share the screen. I hope you can all see it now.
Yep, fine, yep.
Yeah. So my name is Jakob Peterson. I'm from Vessel Performance Solutions. We are a relatively small company, around 18, 20 people, doing performance management service. Right now we have around 1,300 vessels in our service, distributed between 27 different shipping companies. Our main offerings are on the hull and propeller performance, fleet overview, speed and consumption, distributing speed and consumption tables to many different systems, charter party monitoring, etc. And of course, we also measure the ship's own consumption, how much is spent on the auxiliary engines and on the boiler as well. And that is, of course, where the crew involvement comes into place. Just for those who don't know that, Vessel Performance Solutions has recently been acquired by GTG in France. So today we are Ascens Marorka and Vessel Performance Solutions offering our services all together. But nevertheless, Vessel Performance Solutions is, as it is right now, business as usual. And I will now here talk about crew involvement. So before we start doing that, I think it's fair to put on the table that the new regulatory framework in the industry has changed the world for noon reports dramatically. So you can say in the last couple of years, focus on vessel performance has, some people will say it has increased a lot, and the introduction of the CII as well, of course. But the fact is that a lot of the work in the various performance desks and with ship management and so on in the last couple of years has been with improving the quality of the noon report so that they can get the verification from the various verifiers out there. It's clear that quality is improving and it is creating more transparency. And of course, you do have variations in the individual noon reports. They are still subject for interpretation, so to say. But at the end of the day, it's obvious that the ROB numbers going in and out of the harbors will improve in quality over the long run with the new regulatory framework. All the data has to be verified, and the verification will become more and more strict as we move forward. That's our expectation, at least. So when we talk about crew involvement, then we also have to remember that the crew can do a lot. And their main objectives are to minimize the required energy to achieve what we call their mission objectives. And of course, then they have to produce that energy in the most efficient way. That's what the crew can do on board. On top of that, of course, the voyage planning and execution, the crew is a very essential part of that as well. But it's also fair to say that we also have to understand that when it comes to vessel performance, then there is a lot of topics where the crew has very little influence on what's going on the ship. It's just, you could say, a remark that I think is relevant to put on the table. For example, the crew does not have influence on what kind of equipment is it that is being invested on the ship. That is something that is done in the office. Dry dockings, hot cleanings, propeller polishes, etc. That is also not something that the crew has a huge influence on. In order to engage with the crews, we developed in our shipping lab project that we had a 3-year-long project with support from the Danish Innovation Fund. We developed a crew feedback module with some objectives. First of all, we wanted to visualize and give feedback to the crews, the figures that they actually type into the various noon reports and maybe also from sensor data. We wanted to show performance indicators so that the crew can see the impact of their own actions, quantify and improve the data qualities. Here, actually, the crew feedback module has turned out to be extremely efficient because the crew can actually see their own you could say, issues that they have with the reporting from the ship. And finally, the one that motivates the crew the most, it is compare themselves to vessel peers. This is one of the factors that we believe is very efficient to motivate crew and engage crews. We have to realize that when you are running 1,300 vessels, then you have all kinds of cultures from all over the world. And many different companies and types of companies, charterers, owners, ship managers, and so on. We have them all in our portfolio. So it's not so easy to do something very specific on each individual vessel. So the crew feedback module had to be something that was rather top down because we could not go into the details of every single vessel. So this is an overview of how our crew feedback module looks like, and you can see different widgets, we call them. So each of those quadrubles here, they include, you could say, some underlying functionality. And yeah, there is the map, of course. We have the base load, we have the data quality. You can see time series of various parameters that the crew has reported. And then we have the weather comparison plot in this depiction here, but it's configurable, so every client can have his own setup of what he wants to show to the crews on board. Another slide here shows you how we try to encourage what we call friendly competition between the ships. This one shows the daily baseload in the harbor mode, and where there's a baseline, and then there's the actual consumption. And here, this vessel P, you can see that they are actually right on the baseline. Whereas another vessel R is spending 0.7 ton more on a daily basis in the harbor module. And of course, the idea here is that when the vessel R sees that, then hopefully they will be encouraged to try to see how can I improve on my performance here. That's the general idea of the benchmarking between peers. Of course, with the underlying agenda that if we can get the vessels engaged in this, then you don't need to have expensive resources in the office to send emails to the vessels and so on. They can actually try and do and improve by themselves. The data quality is another very important module here, where the vessels can see what are the problems that I engage or that I meet with the reporting that I'm doing, and then they can see the problems they have, and then of course they can see that they can also improve in quality of data as well. Of course, there's underlying functions here as well. And then lastly, which I think is very, very important, and where the crew feedback module has actually turned out to be extremely powerful, is that you have all this verification going on with the verifiers of the Noon data. And one thing is that we have in our system our validation rules that are checking the data, plausibility checks and so on. But of course, each verifier has their own version of those verifications, so that they can check that the data actually meets the requirements from the different regulatory frameworks. And here we have actually developed that in our crew feedback module. It is possible to show the results of these verifications to the crew on board, which has been a tremendous help for a lot of our clients when they are trying to get the vessels to report so that the data can be verified. And the advantage of showing it to the vessels here is, of course, that the vessels can see their own mistakes and then rectify them on board, whereby you are releasing a lot of resources in the office. It's obvious for our clients, a lot of our clients, they have spent an enormous amount of resources in the last 2-3 years in trying to get the data verified with the verifiers. With this module on board, where you can see the validation rules that have triggered with the verifiers, you can actually get those fixed by the crew themselves, and thereby releasing a lot of resources in the office. So when it comes to crew involvement, it's of course an extremely complex thing to do, because the crew's main objective is to get the vessel from A to B. And when they have done that, then they actually think that the job is done. Our job is to try to encourage them to do it in the most efficient way, of course. It's something that comes on top of the normal objectives. But what is it that we are seeing right now? We see a very, very improved quality of data from the new reports. We think that in the future, a lot of efforts has been spent on this in the last couple of years, and that will probably happen in another couple of years as well, going forward. But we think that this will become a kind of a commodity. All the data collection platforms and all the verification and validation and all that will become pretty standard in the future, and it will for sure create a lot more transparency. All the numbers will no longer be blurred between the charterers and the owners. And our hope is then that instead of having this extreme focus on verification of data, Noon data, so we can get the stamp from the verifiers, is that the focus will shift more to vessel performance, where we can then start working on improving our efficiencies. Here, the CII has proven to be, you could say, one way of creating awareness on this, even from charterers as well. No matter what, the crew is a super essential part of this, and we definitely need the crew to be involved in this process. Otherwise, we cannot improve. I think that was what I had to say for today.
Well, thank you very much, Jakob. So there's already a question for you from Faraz Eftekar, who's a fleet performance specialist at Ultra Bulk, who you probably know.
Yeah, I know. I will answer in the Q&A.
Yeah, quite a big question about the change in behaviour. How do we tackle this? So I think Harriet is. I think that's exactly what she's going to talk about. But it looks like could be a scope for much more discussion about this. But now I'd like to. We're going to Colchester, which is just outside London. Welcome, Harriet Johnson. Cheers from Signal. You're on mute at the moment, I think, Harriet. If you'd like to start.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Yep. Your camera's off.
Fantastic. Let me start the video for you as well. There we go.
There we go.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely here to talk about a bit about human motivation, and that's what we do at Signal. So thank you, Carl. So as you've seen, Jakob gave us some fabulous examples there that shipping today has more data and dashboards than we have ever had before. This is definitely a positive step to understanding and showing our vessel's efficiency, and that is only going to increase. But the crew on board vessels are not always taking the most efficient decisions within the limits of safety and capability that they have. Let's take an example of a small but typical efficiency decision that they have to make on board. An engineer has 3 auxiliary engines running, let's say, and then the load drops. It drops to a level where he or she can take 1 auxiliary offline. But it's smoko time, and that coffee pot is full and it's waiting for them in the crew mess. Now, does our engineer take the logical, efficient decision to stay and turn off the engine, or do they go and grab a coffee? Hey, it's only 20 minutes extra running time after all, even 10 maybe. So the graph here shows how the variance in behavior for this task, that's meeting the power demand for the vessel with the efficient number of engines when safe and possible to do so. Each coloured line here represents a different company, and each dot on that line is a different person. So you see some people are efficient 5% of the time for this behavior, and others 90% of the time. We even find that within the same company. And then you see company profiles vary as well. This is not about training. This person knows how to do the task. It's not about insufficient data either. The PMS has shown them exactly what is going on. They know what needs to be done. This is about human decision making and what actually motivates us to make an efficient decision. Surprisingly, saving money for your employer is not a major motivating factor for anyone, let alone if that person, that employer, is a distant charterer hundreds of miles away that you have little contact with and will probably never meet. And saving money in the eyes of the crew, that's all efficiency is, right? At Signal, we found that crew could be supported by motivating that efficient decision making. So we're priming mariners now to actually care more about decarbonisation and then empower them to better understand the direct impacts that they can have. So these behaviour change techniques can be used to engage the crew to enhance their efficiency behaviours. They then steer the crew to make the most of any performance monitoring tools they have and actually want to do that. So here are some of the examples of how we achieve that at Signal. So we use techniques like recognizing personal milestones. So that gives that sense of personal achievement, this positive number, 100 tons. It's down to you, not the ship, you. Normally, all communication from ashore is around what has been done badly or consumption targets that have been missed. Captains of ships today get very little positive feedback and praise right now. You hear from the office, it's normally bad news. We turn that on its head. We offer personal targets. So these are set using a person's actual historical data tracked back across different vessels. It's always realistic based on the data that they have provided, and it's achievable. If you set a generic KPI based on a vessel or a company target, those crew at the bottom of that curve I showed you at the beginning, or that graph, they find it unreachable and they just give up. And those at the top will also often be demotivated, as the target is for them, it's too low. We also do impact reframing. So this puts any fuel savings in a relatable way. So you've done the equivalent of planting 10,000 trees or taking 100 cars off the road. That really empowers people and gives them worth to every efficient action that they take. Pro-social incentives. Now, this is another way of making the crew feel positive about achieving a goal. As with every goal they achieve, $10 or a sum of your choice is donated to a charity that they care about. So now you're not only improving your personal performance, You're having a sizable impact in saving the world for the next generations, and you're doing good by supporting charity. And all this by doing your job well. This personal approach really works on board. We saw this with our first trial, which was with BSM. And here we actually saved an average of 5 tons per vessel per day on main engines, and just under 1 hour of running time on auxiliary engines, again, per vessel per day. And this saving seems so high to us because we came from the airline industry where it was about 1 to 2% that we tend to save for pilots flying airplanes. And here we're up to almost 12%. It was huge. And so we took our findings to UMass to peer review our work. And they did just that. And then they gave the method a thumbs up, agreeing that behavioral change alone had indeed produced significant fuel savings. And so then from that trial, we continued to expand into other sectors with varying stakeholders around the vessel. Working with bulkers, tankers, tugs, and container vessels, we see that this human factor is one of the few things that remains constant across the whole industry. And we consistently see between 5 and 12% different in fuel efficiency from a positively engaged crew. And that's why we say that actually your crew are your superpower. That coffee pot, it won't always win over efficiency, but if you positively engage and motivate their decision-making to save fuel and then to cut carbon. And that's it from me.
Wow, 5 to 12%, that's phenomenal. I was thinking about these sales that companies are putting on ships. They talk about similar savings, 10%, and this sounds a lot easier and cheaper, but it also takes a lot of focus and effort to get it right, I think. So, yeah, fantastic. So we'll go to Mikael Lorin from Manta Marine to do the third talk now. I'd like to welcome Michael to start.
Thank you. Harriet, if you stop sharing, I can get in, I believe. Hi, by the way, I'll talk while we're getting that done. Hi, Michael Lorin from Manta Marine. Some of you might know us as Yara Marine. We just changed names a couple of months ago, or a month or a half ago. So again, I'm here to continue on what Harriet and Jakob have been speaking about. So I'll get to that in a second.
Yep, that's all fine.
There we go. Good. So what I want to talk about is that basically, again, building on what Harriet and Jacob has said, what we see many times is we work with technical solutions to a big part. But what we also see is that that's one part of the solution. I fully agree with previous speakers. The big part that you often miss is actually getting the crew and the onshore organization involved. And looking at this little table from DNV, you can see that ship operation is actually where you usually have the biggest potential to save fuel compared to other things when it comes to condition and technical solutions. That said, I'll give you 2 minutes about, we did a project a while back. It was a project looking at how AI-based planning systems can actually save fuel and help the crew. But it had 3 goals, and the third goal was actually from a social aspect where we had behavioral scientists from 3 universities looking at how the system was used on board, how it was received on board, and what we can learn from that. And very, very simply put, you can make a very, very intelligent system, but it needs to be built to address the needs of the crew that will use it. So what we saw was that exactly what Harriet talked about is that building a perfect system is one part of the solution. But the other part is to have the crew understand how to use it, encourage them to use it, and also encourage them to modify how they work, because otherwise they'll keep doing what they've done all the years before. And of course, one part of that is to make sure the technology, the interfaces are fit for what the crew is doing and how they're used to operate, or again, explain why they need to change. We see this, we worked mainly with the crew on this, but we also saw a big part is on the shore organization to support the crew in this, to use tools like what Harry just showed, to help them understand the benefits of actually changing your behavior. That said, coming back a little bit to what Manta Marine does, we usually look at a voyage in 3 stages. You have the voyage planning phase, where you plan your voyage, you look at your route, cargo loading operations, and so on. You have the execution, actually going from point A to point B. And you have the post-voyage part, where you do your reporting and analysis. We like to see that as a wheel, because again, if you do this right, you will keep learning from what you're doing and keep learning about what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong. And one of the parts that we believe there's more to do in is the voyage execution part. Very simply put, most vessels, no matter size, cost, where they go, operate their machinery with a lever, with numbers on it from 1 to 10 or 0 to 100. That doesn't really mean anything. And that way you're trying to control a lot of parameters. We believe by giving the crews a better tool to implement the actual voyage instructions, the plan that you made before the voyage, you can save a lot. And you can save a lot of fuel by controlling the right aspects. Usually, you don't care about RPM. You care about speed, you care about consumption, and those are the big things. They are money, and money is important. So looking at what our tool Fuel Up does, it gives you, the crew, a very simple panel where you basically can dial in your speed and your consumption, or both. Push the on button, and that's what you get. You control the parameters that really matter. You also simplify things for the crew, because usually voyage instruction is based, could be an ETA if that is important, could be a consumption if you're more focused on cost. But now you can control on the factors that you need. Also, this is an example actually from this week where we're looking at one vessel. We knew they had voyage instructions saying, please run at 30 knots speed of ground. And the left part of the graph here, where you have the pink speed of the ground and the gray-green line is basically consumption. We saw that they were running a little bit too fast, and they were also trying to control speed of the ground again through the lever. Then they put the system on, and then they got the speed that they actually had planned to have. And that gave a huge saving in this particular case, because instead of trying to hit something with not enough data, the system supported them to get what they actually wanted. In this case, they had a 19.8% saving. That's pretty extreme, but still, they lost 0.6 knots and got the consumption down dramatically. And again, life got simplified because they didn't have to think about it. They dialed in the figure they wanted and got going. That is the voyage execution part. After the voyage, we usually talk a lot about how to measure. This is a vessel that I've been on, and with this, it might be difficult to measure what your consumption is or how things are doing. And it's an axiom that if you can measure it, you can manage it. So we're strong believers in collecting data. And today, if you have a smartwatch, your Apple or whoever probably knows a lot more about you than you do, because they have all the data. So do you. But the question is that data gonna help you, or will it just give you information overload? Again, back to what's been said before, there's so much data, there's so much analysis tools, but the trick is to take the data you need. If it's some data where you have noon reports, make sure it's correct, just like Jack talked about. If you can automate, you can get a lot more data, but make sure you don't drown in it. And if you want to use AI tools, again, as been said, you need to make them correct, but then you need to make sure you can collect that data in and make use of it, make it an actual decision support and not just a bunch of figures. What we see is that sharing data, just making data visible is very important, both when for the crew to know how are they performing, to show them what they are doing and how that's what results they get from that. Again, going back to previous presenters, exactly the same thing, making sure they can understand what happens when they do something. Also, crew has a lot of reporting these days, and as been said, a lot of different systems that needs to be filled in. Automating that, simplifying reporting is another thing that I think is going to grow going forward to help the crew focus on what they're good at. And of course, once you have a lot of data, you can start analyzing it and learn from it. And that's when you get back and close the loop. You take what you learn and you implement that into the planning of the next voyage to continuously improve how we operate. So basically closing the loop. Again, what we've seen is that you can make a very simple to use tool in our mind, but you still have to educate. You need to train people with the tool. You need to tell them why they should have it. You need to show the results so they can see that actually using this tool will help me save fuel. These are the results from it. Whether it's a tool or whether it's a procedure you change, extremely important to get everybody on board. And of course, this is something we need to do now. We often, in our engineering dense part of the industry, there's a lot of engineers and sometimes too few behavioral scientists or people persons that educate, share the message, and make sure we start changing. We have many examples where tool makes 2%, educating about the tool makes another 10. So there's a lot to be had by focusing on the people. And that's my part of the presentation. Thank you for listening.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Michael. So I'd like to invite Harriet and Jakob to turn your cameras on. And if anybody has any questions, we're open to questions. But I think we can start. So the question from Faraz, if we talk about it in a general sense, motivating people is very hard. And any business has been through this challenge that when your client or your customer is a big company and people think it's not worth doing and what's in it for me, and everybody's motivations are different, yet somehow some things do work as you're showing here. So to be completely cynical that people can't be motivated is the wrong answer, but also don't want to think it's too easy either. I don't know if that's a good place to start with the discussion. Should we Jakob, you were putting some thoughts in the question there. Do you want to start with that? Start there, Jim?
Yeah, I think for us, this question is, of course, dealing with, you could say, one of the biggest barriers that we have in shipping, that you have the charterers who charter in vessels, and they basically just want some cargo to be transported from A to B, and then you have the ship owner and we call them the tonnage providers that charter out their vessels, and the charterers are supposed to pay for the fuel. And the tonnage provider has no motivation to improve on efficiencies, and the crew is hired by the tonnage provider. They are hired by the ship management part. So they are their employer, and their employer has no incentive to actually save on the fuel bill. So in our take, I've been in this business for quite some years, and I think this is the biggest barrier that we have. And what we hope that the new legislation will do is that it will create so much transparency that it becomes obvious for both charterers and ship owners or tonnage providers at the same time that the only way we can make shipping more efficient is if we work together. I don't think that has been a normal practice in very large part of the industry. Of course, there are companies like the big container operators where they pay for the fuel and they still have half of their fleet, which is internal and all that. They have a lot of incentive to improve, and they are working a lot on this as well. In one of our clients is, for example, Tom. They have 80 tankers, right? And they run and operate and own everything by themselves. They have a huge motivation to do this. But that's a small part of the industry, actually. The very large part of the industry is where you have the traditional split between charterers and tonnage providers. And here, I hope legislation makes this so transparent that the business cases become so obvious for both parties that we can work together to improve efficiencies. I think that is the biggest challenge. And Faraz is working in a company which is mainly a charterer. They charter in vessels, right? And it's very, very difficult, if not to say impossible, for them to motivate the vessel crews to improve on efficiencies. It's very difficult. I think that pressure has to come from the tonnage providers, because they are the ones that are hiring the crews. But then you can also argue, if they need to be motivated, well, then that motivation needs to come from the charterers. The charterers have to put pressure on the tonnage providers to deliver efficient transportation work. And that is the way the industry is going right now, I hope. And I think legislation is helping us a lot in that. That was a lot for me, sorry.
Yeah. Harriet, do you want to give your perspective? So I suppose the tools you're offering, if you give people personal targets, I suppose maybe it motivates 60% of people, but not 100%. But 60% is worth having, or is that?
Yeah, so I mean, Jakob talked a lot there about pressure and where the pressure is going to come from. Pressure doesn't really motivate people. What we need to do is turn that on its head, and we need to positively engage them. Faraz is absolutely right that crew on board vessels, if they are demotivated, if they're frustrated, if they're demoralized, I think there's probably a mental health aspect to this, but let's not go into that in this webinar. Then they just don't have the capacity for this idea around comparison and gamification, because they're full up, for want of a better word. It's that cognitive load. So we need to be a bit more gentle with them, in my opinion. It needs to be positive engagement. And actually, in the airline industry, we've seen that direct comparisons, are really demotivating, to the point where the unions have now banned it. Any comparison, fuel efficiency comparison between individuals, because you find the people at the top of that league table, they get complacent. They're like, well, I'm just good all the time. And the ones at the bottom, they're just demoralized, they're demotivated. In exactly the way that Faraz is saying here in this question, he's just saying they just don't care about what the other vessels are doing. So that's why I think that we need this positive engagement. We need a positive way. Well, if you're going to go and run a marathon, as Mikael used the fabulous analogy of your Fitbit, you don't go out there and compare yourself to everyone in the world who's ever run a marathon, because that's just demotivating. You do your couch to 5K or whatever it is, and you get set these little personal targets that based on you and how you perform, and that then motivates you day by day to continue to doing your job. And it's about being positive. It's about the idea that you need to recognize these crew of people, and we need to communicate positively with them about what they're doing and how they're doing things.
Yeah, Mikael, we were talking before we started about your shipping family background, and I guess if that's a strong motivator if you care about the industry, you've been in it a long time, but perhaps the truth is that some people care more than others, but the people who do care, we need to bring them out to the front, and perhaps it's the same on board ships. Is that a...
Yeah, yes, I fully agree. And it was interesting because when the company started, we actually had part owners in the vessel sailing on the vessel. And I understand that's not something you can do in most companies, but for those ships, that was amazing because the captain, the chief, even had a chef who had invested in the vessel. They were extremely motivated,
of course,
to get things right. And if you can, again, a little bit of an extreme example, but we're trying to keep that philosophy and that culture in the company, and that helped a lot because people were responsible for the budgets, they were responsible for their KPIs, basically. And that builds a different culture on how you work with things. There's a benefit of improving. If you're on a bulker for 2 months, then you're off, then you're on another bulker, and then you're off, then you're on a third bulker, you will never get that feeling. You need to sort of build a culture around this. And I think, again, all three of us are definitely seeing that and working towards sort of sharing that there is a difference, and that difference you can make. But it is a struggle to get there. For most companies, you have changing crews, you have very little motivation, and as Jakob mentioned as well, you usually have different players. The yard doesn't care about the operations, charter doesn't, and the technical manager are on completely different set of parameters and what they're measured on. And that is definitely a problem for the whole industry, I believe.
Well, very good. Well, we've got two questions, both going in very different directions. I don't know which way we'd like to take this discussion, but so Mark Eloy Nicod, he's from Opsilog in Marseille. So he's discussing the quality of the data models, and if you've got to have accurate models are very important in knowing if you're getting savings or not. I guess that's and then Yanni Koch, who's a journalist in Rotterdam. I haven't seen you for a long time, Yanni. Hi. So she's asking, motivation is about giving people proper working conditions, or the happier people are on board, the more motivated they are, which I suppose is true, but doesn't mean it's easy to solve. I don't know.
No.
Any of our speakers would like to take you through those questions? Or...
I can take the first one. That was a follow-up question on a previous question on how accurate the data models is. And I'm sorry, I don't have a figure to put on it, because usually you predict something and then something else happens. Weather is usually one of the big changing factors. So it is, sorry, I don't have a good figure on how accurate it is. Again, once we have enough data, it can be very accurate. But then again, it might be very accurate in some cases, and it might veer off. It is an ongoing job to trim the model. Usually when you start collecting models, you have the same operational parameters. So you have fantastic data on 11 to 12 knots, nothing for 10 knots. So again, the data model can be perfect for a span of data, and then might be way more off if you're moving out of that. I'll answer the second one as well with yes, absolutely. And let somebody else expand on that.
I have a comment on the modeling as well. We don't use any machine learning models. We use we could say we build a physical model of the ship, and then we do a calibration of that physical model. And I think it's very difficult to say how accurate is your model, right? Because who knows what is correct? It's actually the model that is reflecting what we think is correct. So you don't have the perfect answer to say my model is correct with 1%. How do you know that? Because you don't know what is right. So a model is a model, and it reflects nature to some extent. And you can, of course, try to work with your model and improve it. And we do that as well. So we build a model up front, so we don't need any calibration data. Actually, we have a model already from day one. But of course, we monitor how that model is doing. And then if there are deficiencies in the model, then we make adjustments to that. And it's calibrated automatically, you could say. But you cannot say what is precise, because nobody knows what is precise. How do you know when it's correct? You don't. You will never know that. And that's just that's something that I think a lot of people ask this question. But the thing is, we don't know what is correct, because nobody has the 100% correct model anywhere in the world. I think that's just a comment from my side that yeah, you can do it, but you have to adjust your models. You have to learn. And whether you do it using machine learning models or you do it in other ways, I don't think that is so important. But you have to accept that we don't know everything. And if you go outside of the range where you normally operate, yes, then you may meet some surprises. That's how it is.
I suppose it's quite important people trust the models. I mean, if we're saying to crew like
Sure.
Harriet is doing, oh, look, this guy on this ship is way better at running generators than you are, and it's not true, then...
Exactly. Yes. No, but also this thing, I mean, with the speed ranges, right? If you want to optimize a voyage and you use your model to do that optimization, I mean, if the model is wrong, then your advice to the crew is wrong. And then you have to learn from that, of course. And then the next time you operate in that regime, then your model will be more correct, of course. And that's how it will work. But the model, at the end of the day, the model has to be as precise as practically possible.
Oh, Harriet, do you have anything on either of these questions before we go on to Hero's question?
Yeah, sure. There's just a couple of things on the first one around models. I mean, we now use econometrics, so we do linear regressions to look at the fuel savings around our trials, but that all depends on having the right amount of data. You've got to have a lot of data going into a model like that to be able to make sure that it is accurate. But actually, we've found that this is a really a very good way to start assessing these things, and actually there are lots of other companies starting to do that now as well, which is really really good to see. And then around working conditions, Yanni's question there, I love this question because absolutely it is. As a crew member myself, the thing that is closest to my heart is making sure that the crew are able to do what they're doing and that their work life is positive. I love what Michael was saying around the captain owners. I mean, that's just the best combination, isn't it? Because that's someone who is actually living it. They're on the ship, they understand it. And yes, this is absolutely right. Working conditions do affect motivation. And I've always said, you know what, the best way to motivate your crew, get a decent cook on board. They'll all do it, or they'll do it. They'll do it all. And around our behaviors, we have to make sure that the crew have the capacity to be able to carry out that behavior. And so it's all around that capacity, and the working conditions are part of that. Yes, definitely.
Oh, very good. So Hiro Yoshida is I think he's a Dutch representative of a Japanese shipyards. Maybe this one's for Jakob. So we're talking about the quality of the noonday report, which I know is a very subject you're very into. And why not make it automatic? I think that's a summary of what he's saying.
Yeah, of course, we see examples of that. And by the way, I know that, for example, Morocco is doing that. So you actually pre-fill the noon reports with data from sensors. And that is definitely something you can do. The challenge here is, of course, then you have to know that your sensors are correct. So that is another, I think, maybe one of the biggest challenges that we have with the sensor data, that if we have to trust them, then we all have to trust the sensors. And we see many examples of sensors showing something and the noon report saying something else. And then the crew will tell you, well, yeah, that's because we know the sensor is wrong. So we put something in instead. So I think the future of systems like ours and the system like Michael's will have heavy modules on automatic fault finding and calibrations and all these things. Because one thing is that you have all this automatic data floating, yes, but you have to be able to trust it. If you can't trust it, then they are worthless, basically. So I think going forward, yes, automated data and automating filling of noon reports, that is definitely the future, but it cannot happen without huge efforts in automatic finding of drifting of sensors, stoppage of sensors, all these things. It's going to be the key for success of sensor data in the future. I have another comment as well, I think, about noon reports. It's true that on the individual noon report, the crew may not have the best possibilities to be very accurate. And you know the timing of the noon report, do they look it up at 12:45 or 12:15 and all these things? And that's correct. So the individual noon report may be subject to, you could say, interpretation. But the thing is, if the ROB numbers, they match when they leave the harbor, and the ROB numbers, they match when they enter into the harbor, and they very often do, then this variation in the noon report is maybe not the most important thing in the world, because we need to know on that voyage how much fuel was spent on the voyage. If that is correct, then that individual variation is not so important. And I have to say also, on top of that, today, when we have the AIS data and we have the hindcast data, then what we do is we populate the noon report with all the AIS data and all the weather that we have looked up during that noon report, which means that we can have a much more precise idea of what has been going on with the ship during that noon report. So I think the future of noon reports is actually looking quite good. And there's another advantage of the noon report and involving the crew. Because, I mean, we all know how it is. You cannot improve something if you don't work with it, right? And by doing that round every day and taking down those numbers, and you know that these numbers are being handled and calculated on by systems and so on, maybe you pay more attention to what's going on the ship. So Noon reports is not all just bad. I think in many ways it's also good. And the last thing about Noon reports, it's actually today an invoice, right? Because you have to pay the taxes for the EU and so on. So that means that there will be more attention from charterers and owners because it's simply an invoice today. And that means it's a legal document, and the accuracy simply has to improve going forward.
Yeah, it seems like a really difficult problem. A lot of people thought this would be solved a few years ago, and it's still coming up as the hardest. I don't know if Mikael and Harriet, you have any more perspectives on getting quality data from ships?
Yeah, just to comment on that, again, we do a lot of automated data collection, but before we can use that for any type of official report, it needs to be verified. So back to what Jakob says, you can have a fantastic system that collects all the data, but your speed log might still have a 10% error built in, and then all of that data could be wrong. So automating it helps the crew collect the data, makes life simpler, makes it easier to collect more data, but you still need to go through it, make sure it's correct, make sure ROB fits with what your fuel consumption is, because there are error factors in that. So I think this is sort of a joint effort. We need the Noon reports, but we need automated data, and we will get automated. We're also looking at sort of finding the errors, just like Jakob said. Once you have a lot of data, you can see there's something wrong in this point, and you can help the crew to point that out, which we do in the MRV reports. When they create the MRV reports, they have to verify the data, and then there's also, they get a list. Oh, by the way, you probably need to look at these 5 signals because there's something that looks off. And this is a process, and we need to involve the crew so they understand what they're doing. You can't just click yes, send, because then you might send off the wrong invoice, to use Jakob's word for it.
Yeah, Harriet, I guess working in the airlines, reading about this, the aeroplane that went down from Brazil, that was a sensor issue. The airlines still haven't solved it despite having far higher risks. I don't know how much you're into data quality and how much you're into communication.
Yeah, I think airplanes are very different to ships because the sensors get put on the planes and the people who maintain those sensors are on the ground. That's where the engineers are. Whereas on board vessels, the people who maintain and calibrate and look after those sensors, they're the crew on the ship. So they are key, exactly as Mikael was saying, they need to be involved. And what we've seen actually is that by engaging them in the way that we do, and I think Jakob mentioned this in his presentation as well, that the crews suddenly care about what's being sent ashore, and we've seen a huge decrease in errors in the reports just by getting the crew involved in it's not just a number that you put on a piece of paper and send off. It's coming back to them, they're realizing, and then they'll suddenly say, oh yeah, no, actually the sensor in that tank over there, that's been dodgy for years, or yeah, no, that fuel flow meter is really hard to get to, so no one ever bothers calibrating that one. Those types of things which are going on board all the time, suddenly they're coming back to the crew, and so they start to address them, and involving them is the first step, and then there's many more steps after that, obviously around trying to take away lots of those jobs around the crew. But for us, we have seen a marked increase in the quality of data by involving the crew.
Well, very good. So I'd like to go on to Emil Holm's question. Yanni and Mark, I think you're getting a bit off the topic of crew and vessel performance, if you don't mind. But Emil is also from Ultrabulk. He's asking about companies who have the hire of the vessel has something about the performance of the vessel in the contract. You pay for what you get. What are your thoughts on this? Could this be a way forward for charterers to get owners and crew to engage? I suppose the answer is yes. It could be, but
yes.
It's very difficult to do.
It is the way forward. You have to have a common platform where you measure the performance and where both parties get a benefit from, you could say, having the vessel perform well. Until you get that common platform, then it will be very difficult to say that we are working together to improve the efficiencies. And the CP structure that we have in shipping today is not designed to do that. You have to go. So, for example, I can easily say that you can just use our system and say, if you go below this with using this system, then both parties will benefit from this and this situation. And I think it is moving in that direction. I think there's a lot of willingness to move in that direction, but it does take some front runners to actually, you could say, pave the way to achieve something like that. But I think that is the only way that you agree on a shared platform that does vessel performance and then measures the performance, and then you split the benefits of meeting the objectives. Yeah.
There's a lot of digital steps, though, between a charter party saying you pay this much if you save a bit of fuel and a crew member making a decision, so I'll turn a generator off or shall I have a coffee? But I suppose it's exactly what you're both kind of tackling, isn't it? Or
I don't think that's far away. I think we can do it today. It just requires a charterer and a tonnage provider that agree that this is how we want to do it. Then we can do it today. I'm sure Michael will say the same.
I will say the same and add a few things that I think the regulations we're seeing now, we have the CII, Fuel Marine, etc. All of a sudden, there's a lot more reporting. If you go back 20 years on the chartering side, you hid ships. You didn't really tell people where they were. We're seeing a lot more transparency today. We have the IES, we have reporting. So all of a sudden, we have agreed on some KPIs on how to measure the vessels. A lot of pools with pool points, etc. So I definitely think we are moving in this direction, and we are moving away from a direction where there was a little bit of a sport in the industry to sort of keep the data to yourself. That's going to stop happening with all the reporting that's happening, and then all of a sudden you can start putting measurements and paying for a good ship or a bad ship when it comes to fuel consumption or whatever. But again, we haven't really had that common knowledge up to date. But we are closing in on that target, I believe, very quickly.
Agree.
Harriet, I think you get the last word. We've got a couple of minutes left. But how do we connect a charter party saying the price depends on the performance and somebody making a decision not to have a cup of coffee but to fiddle with generators? I guess that's what your whole talk was about, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, the first step, though, is we need a uniform way of calculating efficiency that everyone agrees on, because you can't make a charter party around everyone measuring things in different ways. You've got to compare apples with apples. It's simple. But once you've done that, yes, this idea is fabulous, because it means that also the crew are suddenly worth something. A good crew member, an efficient crew member, is worth something. And that, I think, is key. We've got to understand that we have crew on board, and you've got to want to have good crew on board. There are good crew out there, and they need to be rewarded. They need to be acknowledged. And I think this is a great way to do it. You can say, yes, well done to that owner and that crew, because they're running a really efficient vessel. But step one is to measure it properly. And then step two, yes, absolutely, give them that value. I think that's it's a really good way forward.
Okay, well, Mikael and Jakob, you might have half a minute each if you want to. Any last thoughts, or is there a standard way to measure the performance of a vessel today? I thought there was, but perhaps there isn't, is there?
Not an agreed way.
No. I think every supplier, like us or Michael or whatever, they have their way of doing it. I don't think it's so important how you do it. I think it's more important that the charterer and the owner agree together that this is the tool that we will use to measure this, and then you can make agreements from that. I don't think it's absolutely possible today, and we see small initiatives in this direction in our company where this is happening, but in order for this to happen in real life, you would need some of the big players to agree on this together. And that's, I think we are quite far from that right now, but we see small steps in the right direction, for example, for retrofit projects and so on, where we are part of the measuring campaigns, where there will be some incentives from both parties to improve and all that. We are moving in that direction. So maybe in 10 years from now, we may have a charter party where we share this, or maybe in 5, maybe in 2, I don't know, but that's my hope.
It's been taken up by the Global Maritime Forum, and they're being fabulous in pushing this agenda. And that I think is really important.
And I think it's very important to understand that you don't need a unified method of doing this for all ships all over the world. The charterer and the owner just needs to agree, we will measure it by this method and this system. Then it's done.
Well, thank you very much. I think our time's up. That's the end of the webinar. That's a fantastic view on vessel performance we've never seen before. So thank you very much, Harriet, Mikael, and Jakob. And I'll pass back to Farah for the closing words. Cheers.
Thank you to our guest speakers, Jakob Buus-Petersen, Harriet Honeysett-Johnson, Mikael Laurin, and to all our viewers. We'll be sending you a YouTube video link soon with contact details if you have any further questions. Join us for our next webinar with Digital Ship, Developments with Maritime Digital Modelling in Germany, which is next week on the 26th of March. You can book this online on our website. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.